Are we any closer to knowing the precise reason of the Dyatlov Pass tragedy, which occurred in February 1959, when a group of hikers perished under inexplicable circumstances on the slopes of an unnamed mountain that is now one of the most well-known mysteries of the 21st century? Welcome to Timeless Stories, where every tale is a journey through time. Sit back, relax, and get ready for a story that will stay with you forever. Let's begin. The sun was beginning to set over the western rise as the two men crested the hill. A combination of exhaustion and the biting cold of the late Russian winter had slowed their progress to a crawl, but it had not dampened their determination. They plodded on through the deep snow. With only one thing on their minds, they were students of the Ural Polytechnical Institute, and they were out searching for their friends who had failed to return from a hiking trip 2 weeks prior. The dying light meant that they would soon have to call it a day. They did not relish the prospect of finding their way back to camp in the dark, especially through such unforgiving terrain. But despite those dangers, they could not help but appreciate the allure of their surroundings. This wilderness had a calming, almost serene beauty, and they could only hope that it had been kind to their friends. Although their hearts remained resolute after so many days searching, that hope was fading as quickly. As the setting sun ahead of them were the rising slopes of Kokle, translated from the Man word meaning dead mountain, so named by the local Man tribes, due to the fact that nothing ever grows there. For this reason, the vision that greeted the two men in that late afternoon was an immense, perfectly smooth hillock, blanketed with pure white snow, and they would have turned back at that point if not for the fact that something had caught their attention in the midst of all that brilliant white. They could make out a singular dark spot about halfway up the side of the mountain, sticking out like a sore thumb. Completely at odds with its surroundings, it would take them another half an hour to reach. But as they got closer, they could make out the vague outline of a large tent. They knew immediately that it belonged to their missing friends, and upon inspection they found that besides a large hole in the side canvas, everything else was in order. The sides of the tent had been insulated with coats and empty backpacks. Ski boots were lined up neatly near the entrance. Padded coats and blankets lined the floor. And elsewhere they found impersonal items stowed away and a wood axe, and saw at the far end of the roughly 8-square met shelter. The two rescuers breathed the s of relief as they noticed that there were no bodies. They cautiously celebrated, as they permitted themselves to believe that their comrades were not dead, but they could not shake the feeling that something about the scene before them still seemed a little odd. They did not know it at the time, but this was only the beginning of an enduring mystery, one which remains unresolved to this day, a mystery that would go on to become one of the most famous and strangest cases not just in Russia but in the history of the entire world. Over the next few days, they would begin finding the bodies of their friends, but nothing about their deaths seemed to add up. There would be no satisfactory conclusion, and all investigation would quickly cease, not to be talked of again for quite some time. In the 1990s, after being buried in top-secret archives for more than 30 years, the Russian government finally released the details of the incident to the general public. It was not largely known about outside of Russia, but it would gain international attention throughout the late noughties, thanks to creepypasta websites and, of course, YouTube. This is a story you may have no doubt heard countless times already. But allow us to tell one last time. We will present only the facts and try to cut out any embellishment. We will run through the timeline of events and the precise details of the incident itself. We will address every theory in turn and pick them apart one by one. And by a process of elimination, we will try to deliver a clearer picture. But the fact of the matter is that we may never know exactly what happened on that freezing cold night, back in February of 1959. What we do know is that a month before, in January of that year, 9 students of the Ural Polytechnical Institute in SOV and an older ex-military companion set out to hike across the Siberian wilderness. There were 10 group members in total, and they were all experienced hikers, each being rated at grade 2 in their capability. By the institute itself, their aim was to reach Orton Mountain in the northern Ural, a trek which would take them over nearly 300 m of terrain in the midst of a harsh Russian winter. They were led by Igor Dyatlov, an accomplished radio engineer and a natural-born leader, respected by many of his peers. Everyone aspired to take part in one of his hikes, and it was considered a high honor to do so, It was after him that the mountain pass where the incident occurred would later be renamed, making such a difficult in the end. Journey would earn all participants a Grade 3 hiking certification, the most coveted hiking credential in the nation at the time. To obtain this, each member had to hike a minimum of 186 miles, with a third of that distance having to be in difficult terrain. A combination of excitement and determination was in the air, as the 10 companions stood on the platform at the Sov train station, stooped under the weight of their packs. The minimum duration of the trip had to be 16 days, with at least 8 of those days spent in uninhabited regions, and at least 6 nights spent in a tent. Completing this task would allow each member to teach their craft as a master of sports, a distinction that everyone in the team was desperate to achieve. At no point did they consider that this would be their final journey, and that, as fate would have it, 9 of the 10 members would never return alive. We have a thorough record of the group's movements up until January 28th, thanks to Yuri Udin, the 10th member who would cut his trip short due to illness halfway through the hike. Everything else has been pieced together from journal entries and photos taken by the group during their arduous journey. The journey would proceed as follows. On the evening of the 23rd of January, they caught the 9:05 p.m. train from Esov, which would take them over 200 mil north to Sarov. The journey was roughly 11 hours in length and would see them arriving at their destination at 7:39 a.m. The next morning, whilst in Sara, they caught up on some much-needed sleep and then spent the afternoon entertaining the children of a local school. In the evening, they boarded another train which would take them 100 miles further north to El. Arriving there at around midnight, this left them with a 6-hour wait before they caught a bus at 6:00 a.m. out to Visay on the 25th of January. The next day, they traveled further north to an area known simply as Sector 41, and there they would spend the night at 4:00 p.m. on the 27th. They traveled up the frozen Elosser River in the dead of night and would arrive at an abandoned geological site in the early hours of the next morning. It was at this point that Yuri Udin, hindered by rheumatism and other ongoing illnesses, would turn back after saying their farewells. The rest of the group continued, traveling north towards their objective. Udin would look over his shoulder one last time to see his friends skiing away in the opposite direction, his heart heavy with disappointment, oblivious to the quiet irony that his illnesses had just saved his life. This was the last time he ever saw his friends alive. It was on the 29th of January that the group's hiking adventure would commence proper after having traveled mostly by road and rail. It was now time for the hard work to begin. As they made the rest of their way towards Orton Mountain on foot, they continued skiing north along the frozen Lear River into the late evening. Before setting up camp for the night on the 30th, they would head west, following the Opia River, one of the Lear's tributaries, all the way up to the base of an unnamed mountain, marked on maps simply as height, 1079. In the years that followed, this peak would come to be officially recognized by its Mansi name of Kakle the Dead Mountain. To lighten their loads, they would camp here and construct a cache to keep any extra provisions. This was in preparation for the ascent of Orton. The 1 of February would see progress slow to a crawl as the harsh weather began to set in. The low visibility would contribute to the group strain off course, and in the last hours of daylight, they would find themselves halfway up the slopes of height. 1079 Eager made the decision to set up camp, here for the night, perhaps due to a combination of not wanting to lose the ground they had already covered and the fact that the daylight was fading fast. He also, more than likely, wanted to practice camping on a mountain slope as an extra challenge for himself and the group. In any case, it is known that the hikers were settled into their tent by around 5:30 p.m. They worked on a mock paper together, the Evening Go Torton, which was a humorous report of the group's activities over the last few days and also served as a team-building exercise. Photographs had also been taken whilst they were making camp, and everyone seemed to be in good spirits, but whatever took place over the next few hours is highly mysterious and would go on to become what is now known as the Dyatlov Pass Incident. No one knows for sure what happened, but based on the evidence gathered, authorities were able to determine that at some point on the night of February 1st, something frightened the hikers so much that they would cut their way out of the tent and run out into the freezing cold night barefooted and in little more than their underwear. All 9 members of the group died, most from hypothermia, but some from horrific injuries that no one has ever been able to satisfactorily explain. The entire incident remains shrouded in mystery, and while some theories have come close to offering a credible explanation of what happened, none of them are without issues. Midway through February, the first indication of anything amiss appeared. Igor and his friends were supposed to return to Sov on the 13th, but nothing had been seen or heard of them. At the beginning of the trip, Dyatlov himself had informed Yuri Udin, the young man who had left the hike early due to illness, that he expected the return journey to take longer by the 15th. Families were starting to get a little worried because they reasoned that at least a telegram or other form of communication informing them of a delay should have been received by now. But 5 days later, on the 20th, they had received no word. On February 26th, a student named Mikhail, Sharan, and a close friend discovered the abandoned tent on the gentle 30-degree incline slopes of Katlay at an elevation of 800 mem. It had collapsed and appeared to be badly damaged, with a large slit in the side canvas. It had been covered with light snowfall, and they found many of the group's belongings inside, but they were unable to see the hikers themselves. Initially, the search party was made up of volunteers, including family members, fellow students, and university instructors. The search would have to be canceled for the day because to the fading light. The rescuers arrived at camp feeling more upbeat than they had when they first arrived, because they were certain that the group was somewhere alive and enduring the cold in an abandoned house or snow cave. They couldn't have known that their friends' bodies were lying beneath the snow, silent and lifeless not far from their own camp. The following day, February 27th, the full horror of the Dyatlov Pass incident would start to unfold.